interesting to drive around this area. It's hard to believe there's 600,000 people of Korean heritage in Los Angeles, making it by far the largest Korean American Korean community in the United States. And it certainly was at the epicenter of, well, disaster back in 1992 with, of course, the infamous Rodney King riots that were touched off in April of 1992. For myself, I remember being in Beijing at that time in China, working and was on a business trip in China, and I clicked on the news. If you were staying at one of the foreign hotels, yes, you could get CNN news feed. And I clicked on that one, I couldn't believe it. The verdict in the Rodney King case had been announced, and I'm looking at this rioting taking place on the streets of LA. A lot of it concentrated about 6 to 9 miles south of here in south central LA. It's a noisy city. And I just remember thinking to myself, wow, this is absolutely insane to have something on such an epic scale occur. And now we're coming up on, next year will be 30 years since those riots, and you still see a little bit of evidence, as you can see, of my opener in some of the flame outs and some of the burnout. And there's still things that haven't been rebuilt and revamped here in Koreatown. But Lord knows it's better off than it was back in 1992, where there was almost $1 billion of total damage in LA. It'll probably be about, at least $2.5 billion in today's dollar, of which 800 million of that was centered in the Korean community and Korean businesses. Getting on now 30 years later, I was curious to kind of retrace and think, how did something that happened down on Normandy and Florence and Figueroa and way down towards the real central part of LA, how did it possibly spread all the way up here 6 to 9 miles away and wreak such incredible damage on a community? I thought to myself, wow, there must be some deep-rooted reasons for, for taking the fight so far away from where the original battlefield originated. So did some research today, looked back a little bit, and I think it's a very interesting story. First question I wondered in considering the whole situation was, how did so many Koreans get to LA to begin with? And that itself is a big story that traces back to mid-1960s, when something called the 1965 Immigration Act was passed, and that loosened up dramatically the requirements for applying for and becoming and settling in the United States. And of course, after the Korean War, there was always a special bond between South Korea and the United States. Many American lives have been sacrificed to keep South Korea free, but a lot of people wanted to leave Korea anyway because they saw America as the land of opportunity. So in the beginning in about the mid-1960s, they started streaming to LA in particular because of the climate, the size of the city, and they perceived more opportunities. And more than that, they started opening many successful businesses in the mid-1960s too. Well, like anything else, success begets success begets success. Pretty soon, the news of the promised land in LA spread back to Seoul and places like that, and the rush was on. Today we have 600,000 Koreans here in LA doing a thriving business. Now let's go backwards in time now to the roots of how the Korean community became embroiled in the whole Rodney King in the 1992, the whole Rodney King incident and the 1992 riots. thing that definitely put the Korean community on a conflict and collision course, especially with the African American community here in Los Angeles, was the willingness of merchants, Korean merchants, to come in to some of the worst areas and risk opening stores. And of course, some of those worst areas were predominantly African American. Remember, there was still the aftermath of trying to desegregate, give people equal opportunities in America. It was a very uneven path, right? So when opening up stores, a lot of Koreans took a chance on some of the poorer neighborhoods, and it didn't cost a lot of money. They could acquire the real estate rather cheaply. They weren't into leasing and renting, they were into buying. They would often cooperatively pool their monies together and, well, launch one successful merchant. And then when that merchant was successful, they would start the next pool of money. Maybe 15, 20 people would put in, launch business after business after business, as low cost as possible. Well, there began to have obviously some friction in some of these neighborhoods when it came to be the perceived success of totally outsiders coming into the area and making money in those communities. So there was a natural friction point of, well, what are you doing here, right? How did you get over in our community? On March 16th, 1991, at 91st Street in Figueroa, way far away from here, almost 9 miles away from here, a young African American child, Latasha Harlan, entered the Empire liquor store, where she proceeded, the claim was, to shoplift a bottle of orange juice that was worth some $1.79. Well, the woman on duty that day was Ju Song. Normally she wasn't working at the store, her husband or her son would be, but on that particular Saturday morning, she was working when the young woman came in at 10 a.m. Well, she proceeded to walk out of the store. She was observed putting the bottle of orange juice into her backpack, but she claimed that she had the money in the hand too and was proceeding to the counter to pay for it. Well, one thing led to another. A scuffle broke out, and Miss Song claims that they got in a real bad altercation and she feared for her life. As Latasha Harlan left the store with her backpack, she was followed by Ju Song, who proceeded to fire a bullet into the back of her head. Now, I'm not one to speak about the merits of the case or innocence or guilt, but the Korean store owner, Ju Song, was found to be just guilty of manslaughter and just given what was called a walkaway sentence. That created a lot of friction within the African American community down there, and it was one of the original seeds that was laid that helped really fan the flames of tensions in April of 1992 when the riots broke out. On April 29, 1992, a day that will live in Los Angeles history, a day of infamy down here. After 7 days of deliberation, a jury found the 4 LA police officers who beat Rodney King innocent of the charges. Well, having the sense of friction in the community to begin with, and having a little bit of a target on their back as a result of success in the Los Angeles business community, well, a firestorm of protest erupted beginning that evening, and it all began down on Florence Avenue and Normandy, about 6.9 miles away from Koreatown here. I grew up in Baltimore in the 60s and 70s, and well, riots were a fact of life growing up, and I remember being in some real hair-raising riots where airborne had to come in, not the 101st, but another one out of another place came in, and police were on the horseback busting heads. It was a very, very terrible and a very scary time. But once the Rodney King verdict was announced on April 29th in the evening, there already started to be people congregating around the area of Normandy and Florence Avenue for whatever reason down in South Central LA. As often happens too, and I remember growing up, that liquor stores become an immediate target of crowd and mob violence and theft. When people start to work as a mob in unison, lots of bad stuff can happen. Lives can be lost, business can be looted, and that's exactly what happened down at Tom's Liquors down there in Normandy and Florence Avenue. A crowd burst in and started looting that liquor store. Result, over the next couple days, over 200 liquor stores were looted and burned down. But with the success that the initial looters had, grabbing all the booze and all the food and things at Tom's Liquor, spread like wildfire, and the crowds grew larger. National media started to descend on the area of LA, and helicopters and news helicopters up in the air started broadcasting to a shocked nation what was happening down in LA, South Central LA. That attention, counter to what anybody wanted, brought additional people to the riot locations and touched off a firestorm where the burnings and looting spread from liquor stores to, well, wholesale, sending up stores in flames. Well, the police response was as you would expect it to be. Immediately cordon off the wealthy areas of Beverly Hills, etc., some of the better areas in town. And unfortunately, that cordoning off only left corridors open up to Koreatown here. And people started moving out towards the Koreatown area because they perceived that the Koreans were a huge part of the problem that had kept a lot of the African American community downtrodden. Of course, social justice warriors started to appear too. You have the usual agitators that get into the crowd, that sense an opportunity, whip up a frenzy, and get people to, well, embrace, at least temporarily, anarchy. And that's what happened on the streets of LA. This is one of the most important, if not the most important intersection in Koreatown. I'm here at Olympic Boulevard and Vermont Avenue, and you have some of the original Koreatown stores. A lot of this has been rebuilt since the rise because much of it went up in flames. But one of my memories, we'll be going over here in a minute as we wrap up the story. One of my memories was an incident that happened over at a grocery store over here that's still in business today. Oh, that nice afternoon sea breeze, and whatever breeze is coming in, it feels great today. Anyway, with the police having cordoned off a lot of the more, well, valuable, the more high-end real estate neighborhoods in the LA area, one of the likely targets for still had open avenues was to make the way up Normandy Avenue to the Koreatown area. Also, a lot of the agitators and a lot of the, what I would call haters, and a lot of the people that were just ready to blow their tops, let off steam, commit mayhem and violence. Figured this is a natural route to get up to the real heart of Koreatown, up here at Normandy, and Normandy comes up here. James Wood Avenue, you have 8th Street, all the big intersections, Western Avenue, Olympic up here, and the throng started to descend on this area of LA and started to torch things in an enormous way to the tune of, well, over $2 billion in today's money. And many of us who are older remember those epic scenes being broadcast of just fires everywhere. South Central LA and up here in Koreatown. Come over and just take a look at one of the places over here. I was telling you about the market that was pretty famous on the news. We're coming up, we're on Olympic Boulevard still, we're coming up to the Hanum chain supermarket here. This figured very prominently in what you might call the Koreans fighting back during the riot. And the owner of this chain, who is still alive today, and we can see the grocery store over there, decided that one of the solutions, since the police weren't coming and were perceived to be in a stand-down mode, was to take matters into their own hands and organize their own militia. And in my memory, one of the things that I most vividly remember seeing here was Korean forces, positioned on top of the roof line here at the market with guns, shotguns, and unfortunately and sadly, one of the security guards was killed, more unfortunately, by one of the defenders. But really a sad chapter here in LA history, but amazing today that we still see standing the same successful market from almost 30 years ago. I want to thank you so much for being along on another historic journey here in LA history. A very fascinating town. I guess riots will always be a fixture of a free society. I certainly know that riots in controlled societies where personal freedoms are crushed, personal freedoms are non-existent, don't ever occur until they reach such a point of just absolute either abject horror or poverty amongst the nation. Perhaps that's starting to happen in Cuba, in a place like that now, where freedom has been restrained for so long and economic opportunity has been so sparse that people are literally just willing to sacrifice their lives to have their voices heard for change. Lots changed for the positive here in LA. It's a much more intertwined community. I think the Koreans, as a result of the Korean Americans, as a result of the riots of 1992, really took great steps to more enmesh themselves and work themselves into American society by running for office, by starting to participate in American sports, and sort of just branching out a bit, becoming Americanized in their pursuits and in their activities and their way of life. Will there always be a Korean community? Of course there will. There's a big pride element down here, you can tell it, and there's also a sense of satisfaction that so many people are so hardworking and they have achieved such success here in America. Basically starting from nothing and grouping their resources and, well, just working hard, sunrise to sunset. Thanks so much for watching. Close out today with a few final scenes around Koreatown, and always thumbs up are appreciated. And if you enjoyed the content, please hit the share button. Thanks so much.